Good afternoon, St. Paul's. Hi, Kate. It's
Hello.
been it's been a while since we've been able to come together, and we don't want to alarm you. We are not reestablishing residency back in the building, but we are testing out what it would mean for us to be in the building, and we thought that this would be a great time for us to just have a little talk amongst each other. There's a lot going on in the country. There's a lot going on in life. I would imagine none of us could have thought that bringing in this new year would usher in so much for so many of us. And in some ways, people can see this as a dark and heavy time, but I truly believe that God is birthing something. And if you've never birthed anything, then you don't realize there's some discomfort with the birthing. But
Is this like when the doctor tells you about pressure?
yes, yes,
I gotcha.
and yeah, and it is a pressure. It is a heaviness. It's a indescribable feeling that you just can't put into words. It's something you have to experience. And so with that, Pastor Kate and I thought that God has divinely ordered that we would come together in this season of ministry, both as not only women, but women of faith from different generations. And we both have a different experience with what it means to be us in the world today. And so we just wanted to take a moment to kind of maybe introduce ourselves to you again through the usness of this current atmosphere. And so I guess that if it's okay, I can start, and we are going to practice we're going to practice masking. So whoever is not speaking will be masked, and whoever is speaking will be unmasked. And we have bathed ourselves in sanitizer and not hugged or done any of that stuff, and we're not making light of that, but we want you to know that we take that seriously. But as a woman of color, on my birth certificate, it does not say African American, it says Negro. And that is that's telling because it speaks to the era in which I was born. I was born at the time, and I mentioned this a couple of other, maybe a few days ago, that I seem to recall. I was born at a time long before Metro. It was streetcars and buses, and no comments, please. And I vaguely remember asking my grandmother. It was our special trip. At least once a week, once every 2 weeks, we'd have to take the bus to downtown St. Louis. I grew up in St. Louis, Missouri, and I vaguely remember asking her one time when we got on the bus and we sat up front, "Aren't we going to get in trouble because we're not supposed to sit here?" And I can tell you that. Because I am of age, I can't really recall if that's something I remembered, whether it was the streetcar, the bus, whether it was something that somebody told me that I experienced. But that sticks with me, and all the things when I hear race, that's one of the things that sticks with me. I remember my grandfather was a Dixieland jazz musician. Had his you can look him up, Singleton Palmer. He's in the jazz annuals and all that kind of stuff. And for a time period, a bust of his head sat in City Hall in St. Louis.
Wow.
And I thought that was kind of strange as I got older, because they allowed his bust to sit in City Hall, but he was also a janitor. And I would imagine that he could not even walk in the front doors of half the buildings that he cleaned, but people would pay to come see him and his Dixieland jazz down at Gaslight Square in St. Louis. And so that kind of rests with who I am uh, as a person of color. I also remember being in high school. I went to high school, and I won't name it because there's no point in just throwing people under the bus, but they know who they are. And I recall that it was late spring. There was something strange about that day. And as I was changing classes, my high school was 99% white. There was a wall of young white men, muscular, with white t-shirts on that said "White Dragons." And they came down the hall and they pushed those of us who were in the hall to the side. Teachers snatched us out of the hallways and drug us into classrooms. And a riot began. We stayed in the classrooms until long past the time school should have been over. When we left school, there were state troopers on the roof with their rifles trained on those of us as we were leaving the school. We had to be bused to school. The school was predominantly white, like I said. Maybe 300, and that's overestimate of African American students. The next day, they didn't close school. We went back to school. There were only 30 of us black students left. They had suspended all the rest for starting the riot.
Wow.
If I were to have said that made me hate white people, that would be wrong. And I've never felt that way. Now, if you're stupid, I don't like you. I can tell you that stupid comes in all colors, and I'm very clear about that. And I'm not trying to make light, but I have no animosity or hate for anybody who is white simply because they're white. Now, some might say I have more than enough reason to, but that's not how I was raised. My mother raised me. My parents raised me. Both of my parents were there. They're working parents, hard, decent people. We were raised, my sisters, my brother and I, we were raised that because we were black, we had to have our stuff together. We had to try harder. We had to be the very best that we could be because everybody was looking at us. And we would set the tone for everybody coming behind us. And so when you wear that kind of mantle, when you carry that, you really don't realize what that means when you're in high school or a kid or even in college. But as you get to be an adult and live into that, you find out day after day that how I present myself determines how those who look like me will be either rejected or received, how they will be tolerated or accepted, how they will be allowed to sit in places where I may have been the first to sit.
Thank you for sharing your story with us. And I know that's only a small part of your story, but take this off. I feel a little silly. My story is a little different because it is not just because of the skin color, but because of the generation in which I was born. I was born in 1986. Y'all can do the math. And my mother was living in Baltimore City and would have been in elementary school at the time that Brown v. Board came down. So she vividly remembers being, and I think my aunt, her older sister, actually told me this story. But when I asked about their experience, she told me that in their school, and I'm unclear if this was middle school or high school, it probably was high school because they went to the only all-girls public high school in Baltimore. And y'all can Google that too. But she remembers the black girls carried sewing needles. And if somebody got too close or too fresh, or you would get poked. And I don't know the truth of that story. My aunt was a great teller of stories, but I do remember that so I spent the first 7 years of my life in Calvert County, and at that time, Calvert was very undeveloped. I don't think I ever saw a black person before second grade. In second grade, we moved to Frederick, which was less cosmopolitan then than it is now, but was still a very small city, the kind of place where you were still considered a newbie if you'd been there for a quarter of a century. And my second grade teacher was black, and that was the first time I think I remember seeing a black woman. And I think that having that be my first experience, not with somebody my own age, but with somebody in a position of authority, might have made a difference in how I interacted with students and other people as we were, going on our way. So, my elementary school and middle school were very much predominantly white. There was a token black kid in every classroom, maybe an Asian or Hispanic kid or two. And these are suburban, outside of Frederick elementary and middle schools. When I hit high school, that was a totally different ballgame. I went to Frederick High School, which is one of the two intracity high schools in Frederick, and this was they've actually since torn this building down, but the student body makeup was much more diverse. It was about 40% white, 40% black, 15% Hispanic, and then a smattering of other. And I remember high school was not necessarily a pleasant time in my life, but that had more to do with the fact that I was a nerd than anything else. I had not yet grown into myself and grown comfortable with myself. But I do remember vividly that the social dynamic was very different with my black friends amongst their own kindred group than it was with me. The black kids who were friends with white kids often got called Oreos. Black on the outside, white on the inside. And I remember the black kids who were smart came in for a whole lot more teasing and ribbing, and it generally came from the other kids in their neighborhoods and things like that. I think the only really painful incident I had was a moment where I was in 9th grade, and I looked at that point where I was about 10. I was a very, very young 13, and I grew outward instead of upward at puberty, so I was still very short, and a group of black kids passed by a vending machine that I was using, and one of them said, "Ooh, I like your sweater," and I was like, "Oh, that's so nice," and later realized, then they all start laughing, and I realized, oh, they're making fun of me. Never mind. But generally, the attitude that I had, my first boyfriend was black. The first guy I kissed was black. And when I came home and told my mother this guy was now my boyfriend, she said, "We're not going to tell your grandmother about that." Now, my grandmother at that point was still a library in Baltimore City schools. So that tells you a little bit about the continuing feeling and some of the lasting scars from that period. My mother's family was very poor. My grandmother dropped out of school to have my aunt at 16, then went back and got her GED and her bachelor's and eventually a master's from Hopkins. But there was always a very, not always overt, but consistently present level of fear and suspicion. When we went into downtown Frederick as kids, my mom would always, as we were kind of passing the high school and heading into like the downtown area, hit the lock on the doors. And one time I asked her why she did that, and she said, "This is a dangerous area." And I'm like, "But Mom, you work here." And she worked at Winchester Hall, which is right in the middle of the Seven Spires downtown. And it took a while for me to unpack the fact that, number one, I was already uncomfortable with that. Like, I knew enough to question it, but I didn't have the articulation yet to argue about it. And number two, that I had largely been conditioned to view predominantly white spaces as safe. It was, the college I went to, Messiah in southeastern Pennsylvania, was again, 97% white. There's a token black kid, a token Asian kid, and they were in all the advertisements because we only had about 6 of them. But it wasn't until I came to seminary and moved to DC that I really had the opportunity to build a diverse friend group and here, I don't think I had a single minority professor. No, that's not true. I had one, and he was Indian, at Messiah. When I went to Wesley, about half my professors were people of color, and they have become more diverse in the last 10 years than they were when I started there in '09. But that early shaping of understanding that the ways I viewed Black people within my own context were different, that some people were more comfortable than I was, and some people were a lot less comfortable than I was. I think gave me a pass for a long time. Because I could look and say, well, at least I'm not my mother. At least I'm not locking my doors every time I go downtown. And thinking that because I was comfortable talking to individual Black colleagues and friends and professors, that, somehow I was not racist. And of course, that's not quite how it works. But that part of my journey has been ongoing, I think.
Well, we grew up, my sisters and I grew up in St. Louis, and then we moved to Illinois, and that's where high school was. That's where we went to, I went to elementary. Yeah, finished elementary, junior, and all that. Went to college at the University of Illinois. Most of my life, I have spent more with in integrated settings than in totally Black settings. And strangely enough, I was more comfortable in the integrated settings than the totally Black settings. I didn't fit. I didn't fit because the kids you talked about, I was in advanced placement classes in high school. Nope, the only one. National Honor Society, the only one. And so I didn't fit. And you talk about being a nerd. Oh, we could do a whole series on what nerds look like from 1960 to to now. But I didn't fit for a number of reasons. I didn't. I just didn't fit, and so I resorted to. I escaped into reading. I love to read, so I was the Nancy Drew and that kind of and I don't know Black kids reading that. And I'm not saying they didn't. So do not take that the wrong way. I'm just saying, in my circle, that was not what they were reading, and so I learned how to just like me, or I learned how to be by myself. I learned how to be by myself. When I went away to college, it was, University of Illinois, Champaign-Urbana campus is humongous. So it was easy to get lost. Graduated, came back home, and then we moved out here. And I worked in Laurel, of all places. And the only thing I knew about Laurel is that was where George Wallace got shot.
Lord have mercy.
Anyhow, and then I found myself in corrections, and it took on this whole different dynamic because in corrections, there were very few people of color at a level of administration, at the top levels of administration, and you could count women on. So I found myself shifting from this is not just about my color, it's about my gender, and trying to live into that. And then I became, you became the plus one because of both. Oh, we need a Black woman, and there we go. We need a Black and a woman. There we go. We got one that covers that. After you become the person who gets added to the role or gets added to the setting just because you're the right shade and you're the right gender, and so therefore folk can now say they're diverse. That gets to be old rather quick, but it also in many respects, not negatively, but only recently have it caused me not to say anything. I would just sit at the table because I was at the table. It wasn't that I didn't know what to say. It wasn't that I didn't have anything to say. But some of that stuff from years gone by. Just like, just sit at the table and be quiet. Um, that's a strange place to be. That takes some getting used to think that you have a reason to have voice. And while we could probably share. I could give you a laundry list of incidents about either because I was black or because I'm a female that I've either been rejected, resisted, ignored, dismissed. But that's not the point. The point of Pastor Kate and I sitting down is the fact that laws are good. Laws provide the parameters that help folk to respect our constitutional rights, lest I remind you that apply to all of us. However, you can't legislate a change of heart. And while racism and any ism is a learned behavior, and you may be able to mandate a standard of behavior that contradicts that, you can't make a person's heart change. And so part of us sitting down is just, I think that we are far more comfortable to write a law and don't send letters. It's okay. But it's far more comfortable to write a law, and we do need some. I'm not saying we don't, but that's our go-to place. Let's march. Absolutely. Yes, we need to do those things. But if that's where it stops, then we have negated all the work and attention that those experiences generate. Because until we're willing to sit down and talk to each other, nothing's going to change. You and I we're in this strange place of just learning each other. And if you all thought that let me tell you, it's something, but it's also something because we are forced to either learn how to work with each other, or we're forced to fight each other. And I don't have that much energy. I really don't. I really don't. Now I can tell you for a fact, and you probably can't see her face. We don't always agree. We do not always agree. How do I know when we don't agree? Because she'll just look and go, and then. See, but even if we don't agree, we are committed to working together because there's something bigger than us that has to be done. Now, that doesn't mean that there won't be days that as we continue to learn each other, that we won't come to a place where it's like may not be as able to amicably express our disagreement. But we will have built a foundation where we know each other well enough to go, okay, we'll dial this back and come at it again. We don't seem as a nation or a culture or a society to want to spend the time to do that. We'd rather post something and, we'll tag you and I use that term literally and figuratively. We will tag you with a post and won't say the same thing to your face. And I think that we have to learn how to sit down and be willing to let people tell us what they think of us or how we present ourselves. Because let me tell you something: racism isn't just white against black. Racism isn't all black against white or any particular hue of skin color or culture against each other. There's and they're probably gonna get me, but on the conference website there's a thing, the call to action. Okay, and I know you can go on there and you can take a survey or an assessment in different areas. Well, let me tell you, I took the assessment because I like everybody. I love everybody. Everybody is my friend.
Or so you thought.
Yes, and then when it came back that I have a tendency to not want to deal with my own stuff when I'm dealing with people, I took it 3 times trying to make it change. But the truth is, it is what it is. And until I'm willing, and I am, but until I was willing to go like, well, now what? Then nothing can change. And so, prayerfully, this is just the beginning of a conversation, recorded conversations. And why are we recording them? Because if you can't see us having this conversation, why would we expect you to have any conversations? I think you talked about the dynamics of your family. You can understand it in my family. The very mention of an interracial relationship, oh my goodness, that might cause a big problem. The good news is, and that I have a sister-in-law that we call, and she is indeed my sister in love. That's what I call her. And she's not African American. She's white. And I find myself some days trying, like, I'll go in the horror movies. I'll go to say something, and yes, your pastor is still human, so I still say stupid stuff. And I'll go to say something and go like, "Oh, I can't say that. Chris is sitting there." Okay, but that's life. But I've gotten to know my sister-in-law. I'm getting to know Kate. I'm getting to know all of you. And I'm saying that until we're willing to get to know each other, you can't presume to know that every experience I've had has been against me. You need to know that I've done some stuff that has not always been right too. And so, but it's in conversation that we learn about each other.
And I think it's also important to note that there's a difference between having conversation and expecting somebody to teach you. One of the big things that I have heard from my friends and colleagues of color in recent weeks is that they are tired of having white people come to them and say, "Please educate me about racism," because Google exists. It's a thing. There are so many books and so many podcasts and lectures and so let me put this out there right now and say, if that's a conversation you want to have, I am more than willing to have that conversation with you, and to direct you to resources and to explain why you should and should not do certain things. Not saying that I am perfect in any respect, but understanding that there is a difference between learning from someone, developing a relationship with them, and asking them to do your work for you. Because we all have that work. Those of us who have been involved in anti-racist work for years still have that work. Those of us who have Black friends and relatives still have that work. Those of us who have been part of some big performative display of public repentance still have that work. So this is an ongoing process. It's not, you will not solve racism in one conversation. You won't solve it in a single event. You won't solve it in a single sermon, much as we wish we could. We would be making a whole lot of money. But it's on us to educate ourselves and to hold one another accountable as well. So make sure that you're observing the difference between developing relationships and using someone to educate you, because those are two different things. And I think that's a line that our unconscious privilege often likes to blur beyond what is actually right or helpful. The other thing I think that we haven't talked about, and I hope we get another chance to have another conversation to talk about, is how entering spaces where you are the minority as a white person is absolutely necessary to learning why and how you act and react in minority spaces. And that's the story of my last several years before I got to St. Paul's. And there's so much that I learned and some things that I am still learning. But there is education that you can only get from sitting down and shutting up and listening to people who have experiences that are different from yours. And listening with an ear toward how am I reflected, not for the purposes of getting defensive, but for the purposes of how have things that I have done been received, and how how do those echoes play forward into the future?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So like Pastor Kate said, there's no way, it actually is not our goal to solve racism, because that would take the responsibility away from each of us to, and in order for anything to change, we each have to own our own stuff.
Yep.
And so this is just the first of what we hope will be a couple of conversations where you get to see us, just having conversation. You might be able to tell in sometimes that by our expression, maybe somebody said something like, okay, that's okay.
We're adults.
We're adults, and we know how to. The good news is that I think sometimes we try too hard not to be ourselves, and in doing so, we negate the whole effort. So, what we hope you will take from this first opportunity of sitting with us is that you will find a way to start a conversation with somebody you know. Let's be real. Do not go out on the street and pick a stranger to start talking to.
Please do not do that. We don't want those letters and emails.
That is not going to work. And seriously, it won't work. But you'd be surprised what you don't know about the people you do know. And so start having a conversation with someone you know. Just have one conversation. You don't even have to, draw out the big R card. You don't have to talk about race. But you can ask them, what was it like growing up? What was it like in school? And you may find out a lot more than you may have ever known. And in doing that, you invite people to share their stories. And it's in the sharing of stories that we find out that we have far more in common than we have differences. And so, again, we're not trying to solve the race problem. We're not trying to set an example for, how this black pastor and a white pastor can serve together. Let the church say amen. That's not what we're doing. But what we're showing you is that two adults can sit down and have a conversation, and an unscripted conversation, a very, relaxed conversation, and find out more about each other than we could ever thought we could have found out. So I hope that you take something more away from this than we could have imagined. And we just want you to stay tuned because there are more of these to come.
Amen.